The team at ITM Productions are pleased to announce that we are partnering with the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply to create a program to improve understanding of the work done by the industry. Procurement, people, planet, profit.
The big priorities today are increasingly being set by what are the important issues for society. So, sustainability. How do you ensure that you are using scarce resources responsibly? Ethics. How do you ensure that you have got no fraud, no corruption, no modern-day slavery in your supply chains? And then the whole agenda around ensuring security of supply, which was some of the challenges of changes in tariff arrangements, changes in free trade agreements, and those are the issues that have to be addressed today.
There are all sorts of emerging technologies, AI, that are making a difference. Do you think it's going to take the sector to a new level?
We're still in the early days of the value that that can bring to the profession. So it can be about efficiency. How do you do routine tasks in a more efficient way? Or it can be about how do you get better information through artificial intelligence, for example, that allows you then to be able to take better decisions or to be able to take faster decisions.
So what kind of employment opportunities are there for people in this sector, and how do we encourage more people to come into the sector and explore it?
It's a hugely, hugely exciting profession, and I think always has been. And if you think about ethical sourcing, you think about sustainability, you think about scarce resources and how do you responsibly use those scarce resources, and how important those are to society today, I think those are topics that young people really, really associate themselves with. So what about a job which allows you to be embracing sustainability, embracing ethics, and also spending significant amounts of money and then managing those through a supply chain? That's pretty exciting.
Welcome to this updated Ethical Procurement and Supply course. This is something that has to be more than simply complying with the letter of the law. It's a way of life, underpinning business strategies and guiding everything we do as procurement professionals. The course and the accompanying assessment is a key component of this, allowing individuals and organisations to demonstrate their commitment to ethical procurement and supply. This course focuses on 3 key pillars of ethical procurement, all of which are underpinned by our professional ethics. We define professional ethics as the personal and corporate rules that govern behaviour within the context of a particular profession. So, being ethical means behaving in accordance with and having respect for the rules, regulations and standards such as ethical codes of the procurement profession. It plays a major role in procurement and is becoming increasingly important as technology advances and consumers become more aware of the effects of unethical behaviour associated with certain brands. So why is this such an important topic for people working in procurement today? Just take a look at some of these statistics.
Absolute focus on the principles of corporate social responsibility, an elimination of modern-day slavery in supply chains, and a zero-tolerance approach to bribery and corruption. That's what citizens, consumers expect from procurement and supply today. So for any organisation, this is about your reputation. So we all know about unforgiving shareholders, employees, customers. We all know how damaging it can be for your brand, for your profitability, and ultimately for the longevity of your business if you don't address these issues in the right way. So one of CIPS' strategic missions has been to help rid the world of modern-day slavery.
As Malcolm mentioned, for any organisation, this is about reputation. People will want to do business with you, and it makes good business sense. It will be easier to attract and retain the best talent as staff want to work for reputable businesses. Shareholders are keen to invest in ethical businesses because they are known to be well run and show they understand the markets in which they operate.
Talking about key moral and ethical issues in the supply chain brings them out of the shadows. It creates a dialogue. What that means is that when you're faced with these potentially difficult issues, you feel more confident about being able to address them. We can no longer consider profit without thinking about people and planet. These are issues for citizens, for shareholders, for customers and for employees. And anybody working in procurement and supply needs to be aware of the impact that these issues can have on those very important stakeholders. You'll be able to identify, mitigate and reduce both financial and reputational risks. That's very good for your organisation.
At the end of this introduction section, you will be given the opportunity to take the Ethical Procurement and Supply Assessment, which carries a pass mark of 70%. If you do not achieve this pass mark, you will be directed to one or more short pieces of e-learning which must be completed before you can take the assessment again. If you wish, you may complete the e-learning before taking the assessment. Thank you and enjoy the course.
Good afternoon to you all from here in Dubai and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sam Achampong and we're going to talk on the subject of ethics in procurement and business today. This webinar is one of a series of webinars and events that we're hosting to coincide with Global Ethics Day, which is on the 21st of October. So we'll talk about the key features and considerations of ethics in business, and we'll also show you the practical ways in which CIPS can assist you as an individual and your organization address the issues involved when taking ethics into consideration. The video you've just seen at the beginning of this session was the introduction to the CIPS ethics test, an e-learning module, and at the end of this webinar we'll give you more information on how to take that test. We'll also hear today from Suleiman Abdullah, who heads up the procurement function for the Telecoms Regulatory Authority, the TRA. The TRA are one of the organizations leading the way in ensuring that ethics is ingrained in business culture and working practices. If you do have any questions during this session, please use the question answer button below. We will have a question answer session at the end of today, and during that time, we'll be able to address all and any of your questions. So without further ado, let's make a start. So ethical procurement and supply. Interesting subject that many people have a view on, and it obviously comes in many different forms. Now, the definition of ethics in procurement and supply is what we have on the screen there. And it's a little bit narrow when it comes to business because it does govern the personal, that's yourself, and the corporate, that's your company's rules that govern the behavior within the context of your particular profession. And if you're going to split it down into specific areas, there are three main areas as far as ethical procurement and supply in an organization perspective. One of them is the environmental procurement or the environmental considerations. Then we talk about human rights, and then we talk about fraud, bribery, and corruption. All equal and important elements of what ethics constitutes in the context of procurement and supply, and ethics in business as well. So if you think about what the drivers of ethical procurement are, and why do we even get involved in it, and why is it important? In real terms, every organization should have in its vision, in its policy, in its values, and its objectives, ethical practices. So these should be ingrained in what you do. And there's reasons why, there are drivers why they should be. So even if they're not actually ingrained in your values, they are things you'll have to adhere to, because many elements of ethics, not all, but many elements of ethics are ingrained in law, wherever you are in the world. And also, as far as ethical behavior is concerned, your stakeholders and your customers will have a really good view as to how they see ethics, and they'll be demanding that you follow ethics in a particular way. So It's obviously best practice to have ethical considerations built into what you do. But the reality is, even if they're not, you'll be required to adhere to ethical behavior nevertheless. Not only that, if you look at the environmental aspects of ethics, you will also realize that for some organizations, depending on what they buy and what they use, security of supply is sometimes reliant on you taking ethical actions. So to be able to secure those goods in many cases, and sometimes services, you will need to make sure that you're following ethical pathways. So there are many drivers, both internal and external drivers, that drive organizations to ensure that they take an ethical path. And there are benefits, of course, and they are drivers in themselves. Brand and reputation are paramount to organizations these days. And one way you can lose that brand equity, one way you can lose that reputation, one way you can lose that trust is if you're found to be working in an unethical way. And that does actually hit your bottom line. There are many case studies that show that unethical practices can severely affect your business. So that's a real driver to make sure ethical practices are followed, but also conversely, those are benefits to an organization. So those who act in a overtly ethical way will see the benefits in terms of sustainable returns. And there are other benefits as well. Increased investment is being seen. Trust, as I've mentioned before, and also organizations are finding now with the next generation of professionals coming through that their reputation alone means they're able to attract the very, very best candidates, the very, very best students based on their reputation, as long as that reputation has a big element of ethics in it. So there are several benefits of adopting ethics in procurement and supply. So let's talk about the first pillar that we spoke about. We said we have the environmental considerations, we look at human rights, and we also look at fraud, bribery, and corruption. The first one is the environment, and typically people refer to this sustainable part of ethical procurement as the people, planet, and profit considerations. Because sustainable procurement is defined as where organizations meet the needs for their goods and services in a way that achieves value for money, but achieves that value for money on a whole life basis. And some people now term this the circular economy. That's an often used phrase these days. But essentially what it's saying is that if you're taking environmental considerations into account, then when you're procuring items, you are not only thinking about how you're acquiring those items, you're not only thinking about the operating costs, which you would do in any case, you're also adding things like training costs and storage costs, which obviously make an awful lot of sense. But at the end of it, you're also considering the disposal costs. Because of course, maintaining the planet or making sure that the planet is not further damaged, what organizations, especially large organizations who have a large carbon footprint, they have a real responsibility to make sure they're not adding to the disposal of items that are not recyclable. So the circular economy, or the whole life cycle element, says we're not just talking about the traditional procurement cycle. We're not just talking about the acquisition. We're not just talking about the maintenance of items, goods. We're also talking about taking into account and costing in the disposal of that item in a safe and environmentally friendly way in your overall procurement decisions. And that means that we're taking care of what is often called the triple bottom line. The traditional bottom line is profit. Traditionally, organizations will be looking at profit as a marker of how successful they are. But of course, in recent times, people have realized that actually you need to take people into account as well. Profit cannot be looked at in isolation. The way in which we treat people, or the way in which people are treated anywhere throughout our supply chain, has a direct impact on profitability. And so does the impact on the planet. because by definition, a lot of the resources do have a limited life cycle, and without replenishing items or using or recycling items, clearly there is an end date for when we can use those particular commodities or resources around the world. So people, planet, profit, that is the bottom line, and that's how ethical procurement on the environmental perspective is looked at. It's when we as procurement professionals take into account all these factors when making procurement decisions. As far as human rights are concerned, that's a relatively detailed reason why procurement professionals and others in business should take real account of human rights issues. There's some staggering figures here: 24.9 million people forced in forced labor. 40 million children below the age of 15 suffer from abuse and neglect. There's a significant amount of child laborers, 246 million, and there's 27 million people who are trafficked and enslaved. And that doesn't take into account the men, women, and children who are subject to what's often termed as modern-day slavery. The majority of those 40.3 million people are women. So what are the considerations here for human rights? Well, the responsibility for procurement and supply chain professionals on this particular subject in ethics is huge. And the reason for that is that the only reason why there are child laborers, the only reason why there is modern day slavery, and the only reason why there are people in forced labor is because of the procurement activities that actually supports whatever industry that is. Whether it's a garment factory or whether it's fruit picking, it's the responsibility of the procuring organization to understand what the source of those items, those goods, those commodities are, and also what the welfare of those workers also are. That's where human rights comes into your ethical considerations as a procurement professional, because these human rights issues that are mentioned here are a direct effect of procurement. So it's inherently a part of the responsibility of procurement and supply chain professionals to know what's happening all the way down your supply chain and play the necessary part to eradicate these things as well. And that will add to the triple bottom line. It adds to your ethical currency as an organization, and all the tangible benefits that follow that as well. And the final third part of ethical considerations is fraud, bribery, and corruption, which comes in many forms. It's a varied subject, a serious subject, and sometimes it's an often not very well articulated or understood subject. Because fraud, bribery, and corruption comes in many forms, and it could be whether it's how suppliers are billing you or how you're billing them. It can be about contractors abusing the use of variations, by people within an organization not declaring an interest in a particular market exercise or tender activity. It could be manipulating bidding or contract specifications, obviously kickbacks and bribes, and also not declaring personal interests, or declaring personal interests but not fully, and also not declaring fully what your part is in the formulation of a decision that involves procurement, significant or otherwise. So there are many forms of fraud, bribery, and corruption. Some are overt and some less clear. But nevertheless, what should be realized is that the effect of fraud, bribery, and corruption is significant. And if you talk about 47% of companies who have experienced fraud in the past 24 months, that's a very big number. That's a huge number. And then you look at the scale of fraud losses, for example, which have been estimated as 80% of the entire GDP of a country like the UK. So we're talking about over, well, the GDP of the UK over almost 3 trillion. So you're talking about fraud losses being 80% larger than that. So that's a significant amount of money that's being lost by fraud, bribery, and corruption. So 6.5% of GDP is what it can equate to, and 11% of respondents to a recent survey stated that it's common practice common practice within their sphere of influence to use bribery and bribery to win contracts in this sector. So all of this is contributing to these large numbers, and clearly it adds to the price of doing business across the world, whether it's the developed world or the undeveloped world. And often these are parts of the world that cannot afford inflated costs of doing business. But fraud, bribery, and corruption has an adverse effect on the cost of doing business and the overall profitability of organizations in the long run. So it's a very serious element of fraud and corruption, of ethics in total. But overall, ethics being a very, very serious subject, the reason why there are things like the CIPS e-learning and the CIPS ethics test are not because people are inherently or deliberately going out there and committing fraudulent acts. It's because the perception of ethics can differ from business to business and person to person. So it's really an idea to equalize that thought so that we're all on the same page. Because at the end of the day, the aim here is to ensure that organizations and individuals who recognize the importance of integrity are always striving to do the right thing in all circumstances, whether it's environmental, human rights, or whether it's declaring personal interest. The idea really is to ensure that we're all striving to do the right thing in all circumstances. But the issue with that is that everyone is different, because we're all brought up with a set of core values that may differ from person to person. And those core values develop into beliefs, which will also differ from person to person, and they then develop into attitudes, which can differ from person to person, region to region, from organization to organization. So those behaviors then really need to be equalized so that everybody understands what is deemed to be ethical and what is deemed to be unethical, so that everybody is on the same page. So that's really what CIPS is here to do for organizations and for individuals, to make sure we're able to all work from a procurement and supply chain perspective in an ethical way. So what does CIPS do? CIPS takes a four-step approach to ensure organizations and individuals can work in an ethical way. The first stage of that is the adoption of the CIPS Corporate Code of Ethics, which we share with individuals. The second and key and very important stage of that is to train via an e-learning module all individuals responsible for sourcing and supply management. Is to ensure that all those people have been trained in ethics and have subsequently passed the CIPS ethics test. And once they've passed that test, there is obviously a demonstration that they understand the issues relevant to ethics. The third is for the organization to sign a statement of commitment that going forward and looking back, they have a commitment to ethics in procurement and supply. And the fourth is to make sure from a continuous perspective, continuous improvement perspective, that that is maintained. So that's how CIPS works with organizations and individuals to achieve that. The Code of Ethics looks a little bit like this. It just covers some broad aspects. It's a larger document than this, of course, but it covers these aspects within ethics and procurement and business, and aligns that with how what the organization already has in place. The e-learning test that the ethics test that individuals are asked to take includes an element of e-learning, about two hours of e-learning, 3 modules, and then a multiple choice test which has a pass mark. And following that, individuals receive a certificate to demonstrate that they've been ethically trained, as well as going on the public on the professional register, which is accessible to any member of the public, to show that that individual has been ethically trained, and they have a certificate valid for that year. From the organization's perspective, the organization signs a statement of commitment that they will continue to have a commitment to ethical practices and ingrain them into what they do. And finally, any organization that's been through this process is then listed on a public and global ethics register, known as the Corporate Ethics Register. These organizations can demonstrate that they are up to date as an organization in committing to ethical business practices, and that all of their team involved in any procurement or supply chain practice have been trained and have taken and passed the CIPS ethics test. So organizations who have done that include some of the ones who you see on this register. This is a extract from the public register. Other organizations on there, some household names, some lesser known organizations. You'll see, for example, Facebook is on the public ethics register. Locally in the Middle East region, we have Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank and Canon Middle East. The consultancy Ernst & Young are on the ethics register, and the firm Dun & Bradstreet are also on there. So they are organizations who have been through those 3 steps and on to the 4th. So they have made a commitment to ethics. They have policies in place that adhere and ensure that their organization follows the ethical path, and most importantly, all of their teams involved in procurement and supply chain have been trained and have passed the ethics test and have a valid certificate for the coming year. One of the organizations who are on the ethics register are the Telecoms Regulations Authority. Now, the TRA first achieved ethics recognition in February 2020, and they were actually at the time the first federal entity in the UAE to achieve this. They've now gone on to become one of the only organizations in the world who have gone past ensuring that only their procurement team have adhered to the ethics test. They've gone further than that and insisted that all stakeholders in the TRA, not just the procurement team, are ethically trained. So I'm very, very pleased today to invite my guest, Sulaiman Abdullah. Sulaiman Abdullah heads up the procurement function for the Telecoms Regulatory Authority in the UAE. And Sulaiman is a long-time advocate for best practice in procurement and ethics in business. Sulaiman, welcome.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, CIPS, for giving this opportunity. Very interesting topic to discuss. And before I start, Sam, I'll just share with the listeners about a story. A couple of days before the webinar, I was discussing with my friend about ethics in business. And the discussion took, I think, almost 3 to 4 hours, talking about, does ethics exist in business, especially in today's world driven by commercial aspects. And at the end, I told them that if you believe there is right and wrong, and if you believe there is just and fair, yes, business ethics in business exist. And when you talk about ethics, Sam, it is very important to understand that like TRA, one of the TRA's value and objective is sustainability. And to achieve the sustainability, you need to focus on 3 things, as you mentioned in your presentation, about the profit, which is the organization level, about the people, and also about the environment. Having said that, we truly believe that in order to drive value to the organization, ethics an important element to comply with. Unethical practices really damage the organization image and reputation. And I think it's not only cost, it's reputation and your brand. If you lose your brand and reputation image, it's very hard to find partners to deal with you. And another important point to highlight when it comes to ethics in business is not a one-time process when it comes to ethical practices, Sam. It's not like you are assessing your partner once or twice or 3 times. It is a process that you need to monitor in every transaction that the business organization is engaged with. You either engage with the external parties, you either engage with your internal parties and the stakeholders. So it's very important for any business to highlight ethics as part of its code of conduct.
I think there's some really good points there. It's first of all, it's very difficult, but it is very important, and obviously the results are there. So in this day and age, I think what you're saying, Suleiman, and I fully agree, is it's hardly a choice. It's absolutely fundamental doing business in the current day and age that these practices are followed. So thanks for those views. And before I go to you with some questions, because I really like to ask you a few things about the TRA, but I'm going to go to a poll and ask the audience actually. So let's find some information from the audience. So what I'd like to know is, and I hope you can all see this on your screen now, is for everyone who's in the audience at the moment, if you can see the poll, please vote. Does your organization have an ethics policy in place, first of all? And secondly, have you as an individual taken an ethics test as an individual? So really be interested to know what the answer is there. So we'll give about a minute to get some answers from you, and then I'll let everybody know what the results of that poll was. So does your organization have an ethics policy in place? And have you ever taken an ethics test? We'll give another maybe 10 seconds just to make sure everyone has voted. We got so 70% of the people here have voted. So another 30% of you, if you'd like to just put your preference in there or put your answer in the poll, so we can hear your voice, and we'll just stop that in about 10 seconds. So the majority of people have answered now. So let's just end that poll, and I'll show everyone the results. So what we're saying is that yes, so the majority of the people on the webinar, good to know, the majority of you, 80%, 82% even, your organizations have an ethics policy in place. That's great. Some of you don't know, which is interesting. And the other thing is, have you ever taken an ethics test? Well, 60% of you have, which is good. And I think for the other 40%, obviously there's an opportunity that you can also do so. So great, thanks so much for sharing your views there. An overwhelming majority of you have an ethics policy in place. As I said, it's great, and even more of you have the opportunity to go forward and take an ethics test. So coming back to you, Suleiman. Yeah, tell us about TRA. So first of all, how important is ethics in business to you?
To be honest, Sam, ethics an important point, okay, and when it comes to supply chain. And as a TRA, we always communicate and discuss with all our stakeholders the importance of ethics, because unethical practices can damage severely any organization reputation and an image. So it's not about cost only. So we are not only focusing about cost, getting the lower price items. It's more than that. So based on that, one of our value is to promote ethical practices when it comes to supply chain, the whole process of supply chain. So you're not talking about the vendor, you're talking about the community, you're talking about environment and planet, you're talking about stakeholders who are maybe your suppliers and your internal stakeholders. You're talking about also the value of the organization, or your management and your investors, to highlight to them the importance of ethics.
Fantastic. So obviously the importance is paramount. I can see it's something that you're very passionate about, and you and your team have obviously taken you've taken the ethics test, like 60% of the people here. What was the experience of you and your team taking the ethics test?
I personally value the importance of ethics, Sam, and I think the journey started when we signed an MOU with CIPS. TRA management highlight the importance of ethics practices in the organization. So the journey started with signing the MOU. Then I think it's important as a leader, when you're trying to apply or implement any changes in the organization, you need to communicate the objectives and what is the outcome from this practices. So I started by myself, leading by example. I start doing the test. The test really give you a really important highlights on what is the ethical practices, especially in supply chain, and what is the impact of these elements, then I think my team also believed that it's really an important point to understand and what is the value of ethics in the organization, and all of them went through the same test. Now we are glad to be the first federal entity who's receiving this corporate certification in supply and procurement. And we did not, stop there. We even trying to promote ethical practices beyond the procurement, because we understand that in order to achieve the highest value in the organization, you need to have all the stakeholders connected and understanding the value of ethics.
And I think you've hit on a very interesting point there. So obviously I'm aware that TRA has extended the requirement for people to be ethically trained and to have demonstrated that via test beyond just the procurement team. And so you've extended it to stakeholders. And by what you just said, obviously there's a recognition that there are key elements of ethics that cannot be contained within procurement. Statistics say that a vast majority, for example, manipulation of specifications can happen before you get to procurement. So so obviously the motivation for extending ethical training beyond just procurement is real. So it's really laudable to see TRA have done that. And what's the feedback since you've extended it to the wider organization?
The interesting part, Sam, everybody was asking, okay, this is an ethical test related to procurement and supply chain. Why we need to do it? That was an interesting question. And our communication with our internal stakeholder was that in order to achieve a value, procurement cannot do the work by themselves if you're trying about adding value to the organization. So all the stakeholders should be engaged. So we told them that we need to have that common kind of language, so you understand what is the unethical practices. As you mentioned, Sam, one of the example of unethical practices we all know as a common practice is changing in the specification, or having one of the vendors who participated in the tender, he developing that specification for you. So it is very important that communication as a procurement function, you need to be very clear when you are communicating to your internal or external stakeholders the value of ethics and what you are trying to achieve. So I think we are glad to be, or we are working towards achieving that all TRA members who are engaged or engaging with the procurement function to get a certification or to pass the test of ethics. Now, the good part is we are trying to have this, we are in the process of having this as a mandate, that any team members who are directly or indirectly are engaged in sourcing any items should have certification from CIPS and ethics.
Fantastic. And that's quite wide-reaching and really looking into the future. What's next for TRA?
Today, TRA is, I think, in collaboration with CIPS, we are glad to say that we have formed a telco group in telecommunication industry focusing on procurement, and also we have formed a youth committee group. And I'm glad to say that I have two team members, Ms. Sheikha Al Marzougi and Ms. Moza Al Gaidi, are chairs of that group. The whole objective, TR is trying to drive the value of implementing the best practices, especially when talking about ethics, the value of applying the best practices, not only from knowledge perspective or academic perspective, it's real experience. So when talking about telco group, so I think we almost have a representative from maybe 10 to 15 companies. When talking about youth committee, we have ambassadors there. So what we are trying to say here, promoting and trying to tell the community, procurement function is not a transactional function. Procurement function is an important function to drive value. And one of the elements to drive value in the organization is to comply with ethical practices.
Fantastic, Suleiman. That's a great testament and a great account of what you're doing at TRA. We'll set aside the rest of the time really for questions. And I noticed I've got something here which isn't really a question, but I've got someone, I've got Roshan who just wants to say hi to you, Suleiman. He said he used to, he works at Do, but he used to work with you during his time at Dubai Properties.
Okay.
Roshan Khan, and he's saying that he's really proud to see that you've reached the highest status in ethics, which is quite vital in supply chain management and procurement in general. So there's someone who's seen you through the ages. Great. So some of the questions here. So one of the questions we have saying it's quite tough for an organization to monitor ethical practices in all stages of their business. So how can, in your view, Suleiman, I'll put the question to you, how can an organization better implement ethical practices in all stages to ensure the practices are being practiced and implemented?
From my perspective, Sam, I think first point I want to highlight, it is a journey. So you cannot come suddenly in a day and you're trying to eliminate it 100%. So it's a journey. What you were trying is to eliminate as much as possible. Now, from my perspective, I think it's important to communicate to all stakeholders a code of conduct, what we are trying to say, that what we are trying to implement, an ethical code of conduct. You have to communicate that to all your stakeholders. This is one of the advices. Second advice is you need to have a monitoring tool. As I mentioned in the beginning, that it's not a one-time assessment. You pre-qualify the supplier, because most of the well-known suppliers, you might see them having a good documents about implementing the ethical practices, but ethics, it is in every transaction that you do. Some of them can be as a practice. Some of them can be as a privacy or confidentiality of the information. Today we are living in a world of digitalization, so digital ethics become an important topic also. How we can monitor this unethical practices in digital era, for example. So you need to promote the hotline. You need to promote a website if you have, to tell people if they can report any unethical practices. That's another advice. And I think the third advice is you need to have this as a process. It's not like one time. So it's not like I took the certification and I'm ethical. No, it is a continuous improvement, continuous communication to your stakeholders to make sure that they comply. And one of the practices also is good, that in order to teach people what is they have to do, you need to show them the unethical practices and what is the impact of the unethical practices. People tend to understand the impact better than you're telling them, guys, you need to focus on these kind of things. You know, we have noticed that when you are trying to tell your stakeholders, and by the way, we have tried to take out almost some 24 unethical practices common being implemented or being in the supply chain overall. We try to tell people, guys, this is the common unethical practices in supply chain, avoid them. So I think doing that will have a good impact to your stakeholder to understand the impact of that. Because if you tell anyone, can you be flexible in losing your reputation or image, all of them will say no. So it is very important to understand that ethics is not only behavior, it is really practices that we need to implement as an action.
I think that's a very good point, and it actually reminds me of somebody who once challenged as to why people need to take an ethics test, and their assumption was, hold on a minute, an ethics test surely is just asking people whether they would, in the circumstances, commit any unethical practices with a simple yes or no. But of course, it's not that at all, is it? It's all about going more deeply and identifying things that perhaps you wouldn't see as being unethical, and therefore steering you away from them. So that's a great answer, where you give people common examples of what unethical practices are, so they immediately know how to avoid those. Great answer.
I think a story of a stakeholder. He just called me, and I thought when he will call and discuss with me about this, I thought that he will be discussing why we are taking this test for ethics. Then he just highlighted. He really thanked me and said, "Suleiman, thank you for providing this opportunity, because I understood as a project manager managing a project, what are the elements I need to focus on when it comes to evaluation process, for example." So people will value once they go through it, and really there's a value in you guys. I really encourage everyone to go through this test, and it's not like, and I think it's every year you need to go through this test if you want to have your certification validated. It is very good because it highlights some important points that you need to focus on in order to drive validate your organization, especially in ethics.
Fantastic. And another question that came through, which says, procurement is not a standalone department. They're dependent on other functions such as delivery and design. And what happens at their level may not be visible at all to procurement. How can, in this case, how can that be controlled and mitigated?
Okay, as a procurement function, we need to be proactive. What I'm saying by proactive, if we don't know what's the other department they do, we need to have that. I always promote early engagement of stakeholders. Now, most of the time in the organization, the challenges they face that procurement is end of the chain. So most of the department, they do everything, and they just kind of dump on the procurement, just do the sourcing, 3 quotation, and just award the best companies. We need to be more proactive. This is the becoming a certified procurement professional, because most of the organization see procurement as a transactional, not as an advisor or as a function who drives value, drives innovation. Some of the points I really highlight that suppliers and stakeholders who are considered as external stakeholders, really a party who really did severe market analysis and understand their product more than us. So who manage the suppliers? We manage. So we're talking about a function who really can drive innovation. So we have to be proactive. If we don't know, we need to know. And we have to state why we need to know. So we have to have that common language, guys. You as a department, you have a KPI. Yeah, you need to have the project within that timeline. That's good. We need to sit with you as an advisor, as a partner, to implement this in the best way and the best time. So that kind of things, as I mentioned, is not an easy things to do. It requires knowledge. It requires really leadership. It requires communication skills. It requires stakeholder management skills. So many aspects there. It's not only procurement as a procurement role, but there's so many elements add on in order to minimize this.
I couldn't agree more, Suleiman. Question coming in saying that with the requirement to deal with stakeholders on ethical issues, how does the procurement department have an awareness of the technical requirement to avoid the manipulation of specifications?
Very good questions, and I think I received that question several times. I will always say that if you have a procurement function, ask any procurement professional and you ask him how you do the process of procuring things, and if you hear that he knows everything, that's wrong. You need to be specialized in a category. That's why we promote category management. If you are not skilled enough in a particular category, take trainings, be specialized in that category. You have to pick a category that you like, or people, they either do what they like, they need to like what they do at the end time. So category management is very important. If you don't have skills of a particular category, take knowledge or advices from your partners. The problem is we need to have that level of engagement and trust with our partners. In TRA, for example, in technologies sourcing, we have a partner where we consult them every time and engage them every time whenever we source a technology, in order to have that skill gap, filled. Sometimes, yes, you have to do that because you have a partners, and you have to train yourself in order to be a good category manager in that category.
I think that's a great answer to that question, and I'll go back to the person who asked that, and I think certainly it personifies exactly what you're saying. You've got to be, and I think I had this discussion with some people today. You've got to be almost as skilled as your end user department, so you speak the same language. You've got to have that level of technical expertise in that category, and the only way you're going to do that is to do your own homework. So very good point there, Suleiman. A question coming in from Priya. She's asking, in some instances, organizations are given first right of refusal in business transactions. Would you, or in a tender, do you think that is, in broader terms, do you think that is an unethical way to deal with a sourcing scenario?
If you don't mind, Sam, can you just repeat the first part of the question? I couldn't hear it.
Sure, yes. So what she's saying is that some organizations are given first right of refusal in tender situations. And would you consider that unethical? So in other words, what she's saying is that certainly, I guess, in her organization, when a tender is given out, in some cases, the organization will go to the incumbent supplier and say, okay, this is the result of the tender. However, we're going to give you first right of refusal, basically, I guess, to match the terms or match the commercial terms before we give it to somebody else.
If I understand the question, I think in the procurement terms that you qualify the qualified suppliers in the first round. Answering to that questions, we will not say it's an ethical or unethical practice. It depends on the policy. However, if the supplier is not matching your full requirement and you are disqualifying the supplier, I think the ethical practice is that you need to notify that supplier, and you need to have that hotline, a process where the supplier can state his comment. The ethical practice that the supplier needs to know that why he's not being qualified. So I think that process is more important, because what we lack in procurement, I always say this, that the feedback that we need to provide our suppliers, because the suppliers really, I have one of the suppliers who really sat with me and said, I really appreciate, Suleiman, that the TRA had provided me the comment of my performance, because without knowing that feedback, I will not be able to improve and develop. So I think transparency is very important when it comes to procurement. That is an important point also I need to highlight when it comes to ethical practices. I think if you have some of the processes which is not fully automated, focus on automating the full cycle of supply chain management, because then you can have a better visibility and more control on what's going on.
I couldn't agree more, and I think I'll also add to that in terms of the first right of refusal as well, and add to what Suleiman has said by saying that really and truly, you shouldn't add a supplier to a tender if you're not fully intending to award them the business if they're successful. So in other words, if someone is successful and you're then saying, no, we're going to go to our existing suppliers, then maybe you shouldn't have got into that tender situation in the first place, because as Suleiman says, you really should be giving people feedback at the end of any market exercise. And I think you'll struggle to give people feedback to say you were the preferred bidder, but we gave your commercials and your technical proposal to our incumbent, and we awarded it to them instead. So the answer to the question really is that it probably goes beyond ethics. It probably goes into a lack of best practice, perhaps, as well. One of the questions coming through, Suleiman, any best practices you can share to detect fraud?
I believe I can only advise Sam that in order to have a good ethical practices, you need to engage all your stakeholders involved, and you need to communicate to them the importance of ethical practices, especially when it comes to your suppliers and your internal, I would say, internal stakeholders, project manager and user. It's very important for both parties to understand that they contribute, both of them contribute to the value of the organization. And we need to believe all that, all of them need to be engaged together as early as possible. And then we promote ethical practices in procurement because we all are responsible for protecting the organization image and reputation.
And I think you mentioned earlier that that in TRA you have a hotline. Does that work?
Yes, we have a hotline for our internal stakeholders. For example, if somebody wants to report any unethical practices, anybody, he can just report there in that hotline. And we also have a hotline for the suppliers. If supplier feels that he was treated unethically, we call it a grievance committee. So he can just raise his issues, his case there. And we have a vice committee headed by our internal audit. So he kind of be fair, you know, when we're taking a decision, studying the case of the supplier.
And another question that's coming, it's saying, what's the role of digital procurement in ethics and compliance?
I think important point when it comes to digital ethics, Sam, is the important point is about privacy and confidentiality. It's very important. In today's world, I think, you know, there is a white hackers, you know, these kind of terminologies. It's very important in today's world that we understand or we control the privacy and confidentiality, and we can comply with that only by understanding the whole process of supply chain. I mean, because at the end, they always say that you always try to deal with the suppliers who have ethics, and one of the important elements is privacy and confidentiality.
I think you're absolutely right. And privacy and confidentiality, if that's maintained within a tender situation, then basically you're leveling the playing field, which is what ethics is all about. So I think you're absolutely right. We had a question from Harry Laxminaran. Harry, you're on. Did you want to ask the question live? Okay. If not, we'll move on for a second. And I think the final question really that we can ask here was, do you have a view on how a Maverick spending could be solved? Now, that's not directly related to ethics, but it has some hallmarks with ethics as well. How do you control Maverick spending in TRA?
The question is matrix spending.
Sorry, Maverick spending. So in other words, spending outside of policies, spending unauthorized spending, in effect.
Okay. First of all, unauthorized spending. If you have a good P2P cycle as an automated system, I think you will reduce a much more about unauthorized spending in the system. Now, I'm sure that most of the organizations or some of the organizations face this. And when you face this, you need to have, that's why I said you need to have a very strong policy and procedure when it comes to governing the procurement processes. And you need to have a really strong authority of matrix being communicated to all your stakeholders. And I always say that in procurement, you will be able only to reduce the risk and unethical practices by engaging with them and by communicating with them and by having them understanding what is the value of procurement. So it's not only having a knowledge of technical aspects, but I think as a leader in procurement, you need to have that level of engagement with your stakeholders and telling them, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the impact of these kind of practices, unauthorized spending, will cost companies badly, and unauthorized spending will affect the image and reputation of the organization, and this happens because of the individual practices. So that's why when I mentioned that, why we're trying to have ethical tests given to our project managers, because anybody who's engaged in the sourcing process or selection of supplier process, you need to understand these elements are forbidden. For example, it's not unethical practices will affect the organization. So it is more about communicating to them, sitting with them, making sure that the people who are engaged taking the necessary documentation, certification, so they understand procurement language.
That's great, Suleiman, and thanks very much for your input here. I'm going to put one final question to you, because obviously we've run out of time, but the question is saying that the TRA is well known in the UAE for great automated segregation of duties, SOD practices, as an essential practice to combat to control and combat occupational fraud risks. Are there any plans to leverage this as best practice on a federal level?
We are working on that. I'll give an example about COVID-19. And I will be very specific towards procurement and supply chain. When COVID-19 hit SAM, and the first point we have done is, one of the first point we have done that we have established a framework, some of the best practices that any organization needs to implement in crisis. So it's like a framework, bullet points, steps, I think 8 steps, 9 steps. So we are in the stage of finalizing the framework, so we can have it, published to all our federal entities. So kind of sharing our best practices to all our federal entities. Maybe they can get advantage and, from these practices.
Fantastic, Suleiman. Thanks very much for sharing your knowledge on this today. Really appreciate you coming along. Thank you to everybody else who joined the session again today. There is further information on the screen about the link to the CIPS ethics test if you want to take it, but also we will be sending you an email after this session with a link as well. If you've got any other questions related to it at all, please do get in touch with us directly. Well done again to the TRA for the extraordinary efforts they're putting in. Well done for all the questions. We had some really good questions and a really lively session. Thank you once again for this webinar, and look out for future webinars as well. All the best and take care.
Thank you.